Today's podcast is brought to you by AdvertiseCast. AdvertiseCast is the simple way to grow your business or get your app, book, brand, or funding campaign noticed. AdvertiseCast.com.
Welcome to the Drift and Ramble podcast. I'm Steve Blizin. Each episode will explore true stories and American legends. From the pages of history and a few stories handed down over the years, we'll look at the people, places, and events that helped shape a nation. Stories of survival, notable frontier men and women, explorers who struck it rich, and the outlaws that stole it from them. There'll be studies of saloon girls, swindlers, banditry, and bad men, profiles of lawmen and American Indians, and the good and evil that existed between them. We'll amble through the past. We'll delve into the folklore of the times and maybe even uncover a ghost story or two. So, saddle up or settle in for the Drift and Ramble podcast. This is Season 1, Episode 9. This podcast contains graphic descriptions of real events, which may be too intense for some listeners. Listener discretion is advised. The coming of October brings my favorite time of year. The leaves are turning, the climate cools, and the moon hangs low in the evening sky in a special way. It's the birth month of my lovely bride. And who doesn't love Halloween? In our last episode, we learned about the Powhatan Uprising of 1662, in which frontier settler and early American distiller George Thorpe was killed quite violently, quite possibly beheaded and split from stem to stern, by the same indigenous people who had introduced him to corn, the fuel of America's whiskey. At the same time, French Jesuit missionaries were pushing north into the area now known as Canada and the Great Lakes region. As part of the earliest explorers of New France, Jesuit missionaries were to provide highly detailed accounts of their explorations and encounters with First Nations and their cultures. They documented the conversions of Native Americans, and these served as field reports to Jesuit superiors on the progress and effectiveness of the mission. These reports were prepared annually in what were called the Jesuit Relations. Originally, these reports were only read within the church, but soon they served to educate the public in an effort to attract new settlers to the colony and to help raise funds for the mission. These reports were so thorough, they are considered to be among the first ethnographic documents. But in 1661, the Jesuit Relations reported something strange and disturbing. What follows is an excerpt from that report.
What caused us greater concern was the intelligence that met us upon entering the lake, namely, that the men deputed by our conductor for the purpose of summoning the nations to the North Sea and then a rendezvous, where they were to await our coming, had met their death the previous winter in a very strange manner. Those poor men, according to the report given us, were seized with an ailment unknown to us but not very unusual among the people we were seeking. They were afflicted with neither lunacy, hypochondria, nor frenzy, but have a combination of all of these species of disease, which affects their imaginations and causes them a more canine hunger. This makes them so ravenous for human flesh that they pounce upon women, children, and even upon men like veritable werewolves, and devour them voraciously without being able to appease or glut their appetite. Ever seeking fresh prey, this ailment attacked our deputies, and as death is not the sole remedy among those simple people for checking such acts of murder, they were slain in order to stay the course of their madness.
This served as one of the earliest documented reports of the Wendigo, or what would eventually be known as Wendigo psychosis, a medical condition recognized by science to explain the strange physical and mental transformations taking place within the afflicted. While some Native American shaman or medicine men offered treatments for the condition, when those treatments weren't effective, the only other option was to put the victim to death. So what is the Wendigo? And how does this psychosis manifest itself? Is it a curse or a spell, A demonic possession? Or is it just some ancient folklore about a mythical creature? Is a Wendigo a man or a beast? In 1846, a wagon train bound for California took 87 American pioneers into the wild unknown. A series of mishaps and mistakes led them deep into the Sierra Nevada, where they became stranded for 4 desperate months due to a heavy snowfall. It has been said that these are the perfect conditions for the Wendigo. Cold, bleak, unforgiving conditions capped by a relentless, insatiable hunger that began to rumble in the stomachs of those trapped in their snowbound confines. This group, of course, was known as the Donner Party, and of the original 87 members, only 48 survived, many by eating the flesh of their traveling companions. Rumors circulate even today that the Wendigo followed or perhaps even lured these wayward pioneers into ideal conditions for its own craven, diabolical, cannibalistic desires. As the Wendigo is known to strike those near starvation, and punishing the most greedy, lustful, and disrespectful of indigenous cultures first, isn't that exactly what the Donner Party was doing? Eating its way through the untamed wilderness, greedily consuming nearly everything in its path? But the legend of the Wendigo is rooted in Algonquin folklore, a people from the Northeast and Great Lakes region. How could the Donner Party be afflicted with this parasitic psychosis in the mountainous range of the Sierra Nevada? Is it even possible we were talking about the same thing? How had the Donner Party resorted to cannibalism when they still had remaining livestock upon their rescue? In 1878, reports of an infected Plains Cree trapper from Alberta, Canada, named Swift Runner, began to circulate. During the winter of 1878, Swift Runner and his family were starving, and his eldest son eventually died. Their camp was located just 25 miles away from emergency food and supplies at a Hudson's Bay Company outpost, a distance that could be covered in 1 or 2 days, even if only on foot. Yet, Swift Runner brutally murdered his wife and their 5 remaining children, and he ate them all. Since he had resorted to cannibalism so close to food and supplies, it was determined that he had been suffering from Wendigo psychosis. Swift Runner had not acted in a manner of self-preservation because he was starving to death. He had killed and eaten 6 people in a fit of insatiable hunger for human flesh. Eventually, he confessed and was executed by the horrified authorities. In 1907, another well-documented case involved an OG Cree chief and medicine man known for his powers at defeating Wendigos. He and his brother had earned a reputation for the successful treatment of Wendigos, but this often meant the certain death of the afflicted. Hudson Bay Company fur trappers gave this man the English name Jack Fiddler due to his ability to play and build fiddles, and thus his brother's name was Joseph. Like his father, Jack Fiddler became a respected shaman for his abilities in conjuring animals and protecting his people from spells. Most importantly, he could defeat the Wendigo, and was credited with capturing and killing 14 Wendigos. Some were sent against his people by enemy shamans, and others were members of his own band, who were taken with an insatiable, incurable desire to eat human flesh. In the latter case, Fiddler was usually asked by family members to kill a very sick loved one before they turned Wendigo. In some cases, the Wendigo, him or herself, would ask to be euthanized according to the necessary rites. Fiddler's own brother, Peter Flett, was killed after turning Wendigo when the food ran out on a trading expedition. Hudson Bay Company fur traders, the Cree, and missionaries were all aware of the Wendigo legend, but the so-called civilized people often explained it as mental illness or superstition. Still, several incidents of people turning into Wendigos and eating human flesh are documented in the records of the company. When Canadian authorities came to arrest the two men, Jack committed suicide and left Joseph to stand trial. Joseph was sentenced to life in prison. He eventually received a full pardon, though he would never enjoy a moment of his newfound freedom. He died in prison just 3 days after the pardon was granted, never even receiving word that he was made a free man. But the story of the Wendigo is more than just men afflicted with insatiable hunger. The Wendigo is at once both man and beast. What is common among all cultures of the Algonquin-speaking peoples is the belief that the Wendigo is a malevolent, cannibalistic, and supernatural being, one capable of incredible destruction and insatiable appetite. The Wendigo is strongly associated with famine, starvation, northern peaks, and bitter cold. Basil Johnson, a Canadian First Nations scholar, teacher, author, and storyteller, describes the Wendigo in this way.
The Wendigo was gaunt to the point of emaciation, its skin pulled tightly over its bones. With its bones pushing out against its skin, its complexion the ash gray of death, and its eyes pushed back deep into their sockets, the Wendigo looked like a gaunt skeleton, recently disinterred from the grave. What lips it had were tattered and bloody. Unclean and suffering from the suppurations of the flesh, the Wendigo gave off a strange and eerie odor of decay and decomposition, of death and corruption.
The Wendigo's appearance is often signaled by sudden cold and wind, and though it can take many forms, it's most often described as a giant creature with prodigious strength and incredible speed. Tall, pale, gaunt, almost a skeleton, the Wendigo has human qualities, but inhuman abilities. And while we call this apparition by its Native American name, the phenomenon occurs in almost every culture around the globe. In Arab countries, the creature is known as a ghoul, and a simple YouTube video search brought up a video of one of these creatures terrorizing a young cameraman in Iraq. The Japanese have a creature called jikininki, or roughly translated, human-eating ghost. With stories dating back before the 20th century, this corpse-eating ghost carries many similarities to the Wendigo legend. In European countries, the ogre was said to be insufferably hungry and often ate babies to satisfy its grotesque shape. The demonic Rakshasa of the Hindu religion is also incredibly similar by description. These enormous and fierce-looking creatures bore sharp fangs and claws, held incredible powers of inescapable speed and shape-shifting, not to mention a keen sense of smell and an insatiable hunger for human flesh. And in the North American Pacific coast, the creature is called the Wechugay, although it shares much of the same abilities and appetite as its otherworldly incarnations. Otherworldly kind of sums it up nicely. The Wendigo holds incredible speed. Its strength makes it a ferocious and unstoppable warrior in battle. It can climb walls, lift barricades, slip past watchmen unnoticed. In one more modern-day sighting, a hapless hunter had set up a game camera to capture a passing deer. Instead, he was greeted with a sight so unsettling that rumors still circulate about the photo being altered in some way. In the grainy, single-frame shot, a grayish, gaunt figure is seen looking straight into the camera with big, glowing eyes. Its sinewy musculature and taut skin resemble something human, but clearly wild. Though documented for centuries and given the scientific explanation as a form of madness, the condition of the Wendigo psychosis has never been physically studied in a lab or with a caged subject under observation. And yet, this very diagnosis allows no further investigation to be completed. And perhaps that is how we avoid a deeper understanding of this horrific, otherwise unexplainable behavior. Could this have explained what became of the Donner Party? In the 1840s, America saw an increase in the westward expansion as many left their homes in the east in search for greener pastures in Oregon and California. Inspired by the idea of manifest destiny, wagon trains of pioneers drove westward with the hopes of great prosperity on the horizon. The most difficult part of the journey was the last 100 miles through the Sierra Nevada mountains, a range of ragged peaks whose proximity to the Pacific Ocean creates an ideal opportunity for more snowfall than most other ranges in North America. The Donner Reed Party consisted of some 60 to 80 wagons, livestock, provisions, and other worldly possessions. All in all, 87 souls were counted as the sum total of the group. Among them, North Carolina resident George Donner, his brother Jacob, and their respective families, and Irishman James Reed, and his wife Margaret and their children, and Margaret's sickly mother, who was 70 at the time and suffering from the advanced stages of consumption. She died just days after leaving Independence, Missouri, and was buried along the trail. James Reed had hoped the California climate would be good for Margaret, as she too was ill before they left upon their journey. A young man named Luke Halloran was also suffering from tuberculosis and seemed to get sicker every day. Families passed Luke around, each attempting to care for him, then quickly tiring of the ordeal. And by August 25th, Luke had succumbed to his disease. Though the Oregon Trail was well established and by now well traveled, the Donner Party had been seduced by the promise of a shortcut that could shave 350 miles off their journey. Instead, this new route, known as Hastings Cut, actually added 150 miles to their toil. The new trail led the wagon train through territory unfit to support their livestock, and by the end of August, the water was gone, and Reed lost 9 of his 10 oxen, who had broken free of their yokes. Others simply set their animals free and abandoned their wagons where they lay. Soon, the group met up with some Paiute Native Americans, who rode with them a few days, but stole or shot more of the oxen and horses, leaving the group even more disadvantaged. By October, the group had begun to splinter. George Donner, the party's leader, had rode on ahead, while 2 wagons in Reed's group became entangled. Reed had been blamed for taking this new shortcut, and as tensions mounted, this wagon accident caused a man named Snyder to lash out and whip Reed's ox. And when Reed intervened, Snyder turned the whip on him. Reed retaliated by stabbing Snyder with a knife, and the man was fatally wounded. Since Donner was gone, and Reed was not bound by American law, by virtue of their location now being considered as Mexican territory, Reed was spared a hanging, but banished from the group. With animosity and despair as constant companions, the Paiutes returned to harass the group again and again. In the first raid, they shot 18 oxen, and in the second, another 21 were killed. By now, the group had suffered the loss of nearly 100 oxen and cattle, and the horses were being scared off, stolen, or abandoned, as the doomed Donner Party saw their luck turn from bad to worse. Blocked from passage through what is now known as Donner Pass, the group was forced to make a hasty camp of makeshift cabins with no windows or doors, just a hole to make entry or exit, and flat roofs that leaked constantly. Their remaining oxen were dead or dying of starvation, their supplies almost gone. Desperation and madness clouded every decision. A blizzard hit camp, and it snowed for 8 days. Ox hides became food for the group as hunting proved difficult. Again, the group splintered in an attempt to get help and make it through the pass. Men began dying in rapid succession. Patrick Dolan was the first to suggest the men choose somebody to kill and eat to survive. The others suggested they have a duel, or wait at least until somebody actually fell down. They did not have to wait long. 2 men died before Patrick Dolan himself, now gripped by insanity and severe hypothermia, stripped off all his clothes and ran like a madman off into the woods. Though he returned a few hours later, he died shortly after his arrival. It was Dolan who was first consumed by the other men. Although 2 men had already met their maker, why is it that the surviving men chose to eat Dolan first? Was it because he had been the one to suggest cannibalism in the first place, or was it because he was the freshest of the dead? Meanwhile, a hunting party had gone out in search of deer, and they were successful. Upon their return, however, they found the men feasting on the remains of the dead. How is it that even with fresh deer meat now on hand, the dead were still consumed? Had these desperate pioneers become afflicted with Wendigo psychosis? On January 12th, the surviving members of the group that would become known as the Forlorn Hope descended into a Miwok camp looking gaunt, ashen gray, and so frightening that the Native American residents fled for fear of what curse these emaciated beings might bring with them. When the Native Americans finally returned, they offered the starving survivors what they had on hand: acorns, grass, and pine nuts. In 5 days, the group regained enough strength to form a rescue party, and they found the other 6 surviving members of their group. On February 18th, during the first rescue attempt, the rescuers discovered a gruesome sight. Led to the place where their makeshift cabins were, they found heaps of rotting oxen and an overpowering smell of decay. Bodies of 13 dead lay buried in the snow near the roof of the cabins. While yelling as they approached the settlement, a gaunt and disheveled surviving woman appeared from a hole in the snow and asked,
"Are you from California or heaven?"
It was clear that many of the survivors were not of their right minds. On the return trip with some of the weakest survivors, the rescuers found their food cache had been broken into by animals. They were without food for 4 days, but managed to make it over the pass. Shortly thereafter, 2 more died from exhaustion through the pass. John Denton slipped into a coma and quietly died, while young Ada Kesberg died in her mother's arms. Miss Kesberg refused to let go of the child's body. After several days' travel through more difficult terrain, the rescuers were horrified to find that the children and others in the group had eaten the buckskin fringe from one of the rescuers' pants, while others ate the shoelaces from their shoes. Once safely down in Bear Valley, young Jacob Donner Jr. broke into a food store and ate until he could eat no more. He died as a result of his gluttony. On March 1st, a second rescue attempt was made. This one found even more bizarre conditions than the last among the remaining survivors. Although none of the survivors had died since the previous visit, the conditions of the survivors continued to decline, and in one cabin, the conditions were so deplorable, the rescuers were not able to document the scene except to say it passed the limits of description and almost of imagination. One survivor said,
"Well, we were thinking about eating Mr. Elliot."
and the rescuers indeed found the man's mutilated body. Upon entering the camp at Alder Creek, the rescuers witnessed Jean-Baptiste Trudeau carrying a human leg through camp. When they made themselves known, he tossed the severed limb into a pit containing Jacob Donner Sr.'s dismembered body. Inside the tent, they found Elizabeth Donner, who refused to eat, but her children had been eating their father's organs. The rescuers discovered 3 other bodies which had been consumed. Though 17 had left with the rescuers, many were too weak to continue. The rescuers had no choice but to leave them behind. A sudden and violent blizzard claimed the life of 5-year-old Isaac Donner, who froze to death in the cold. Another group attempting to intercept the rescuers found 1-year-old Elizabeth Graves crying next to her dead mother's body and 2 other dead children whose bodies were crudely mutilated. It seemed that the Wendigo psychosis was in full swing. Survivors were still consuming each other even during their attempted rescue. Despite the many horrific injuries, infections, frostbite, and despair, some did make it back to Bear Valley to recover. When a third rescue party arrived on March 14th, one of the rescuers was told that Mr. Louis Kesberg, a surviving member, had consumed the son of one of the rescuing party. The man swore he would murder Mr. Kesberg if he ever came to California. Though 2 more rescue parties were assembled, both turned back early. On April 10th, a final recovery effort was assembled to rescue anyone else who may still be alive and to recover the Donners' belongings to be sold so the proceeds could go to help surviving children. When they arrived, they found that George Donner had only just recently died. On the way back to Truckee, the rescuers found Louis Kesberg alive, and he told them a story of how Mrs. Murphy had died. They did not believe his story, however, and upon further investigation, they found a pot containing human remains, George Donner's pistols, jewelry, and $250 in cash. On April 29, 1847, Louis Kesberg was the last surviving member of the Donner Party to arrive at Sutter's Fort. The Donner Party's tragic fate was well documented by survivors, rescuers, and through the subsequent court case involving Mr. Louis Kesberg, who had filed an anti-defamation lawsuit in an attempt to clear his name. The records and accounts of their survival bear conflicting statements. No one willingly admits to consuming human flesh, but at times they either agree to having taken part in it, or in some cases provide lurid details, such as in the case of Mr. Jean-Baptiste Trudeau, who admitted freely to eating Jacob Donner Sr. and claimed he ate a baby raw. While others say they could not recall with any certainty, and still others were just too young to fully comprehend what may have been taking place. The legend of the Wendigo is one of absolute greed and insatiable hunger for human flesh. A craving so strong, so overwhelmingly powerful, that cannibalism was preferred even when other sources of nourishment existed. To forego a known source of protein in favor of human flesh is, well, it's ghoulish, ghastly, taboo. And yet, this is exactly what happened to the Donner Party. But for the ones who have followed this story closely, and for those who doubt the Wendigo is anything more than folklore in its purest form, consider this. when the spring thaw came into the Sierra Nevada, and the deep snows that blanket much of the Donner camps was gone. What was left were the untouched carcasses of horses and cattle that could have provided food for many days or even months. And perhaps the strangest detail of all, completely overlooked by most who read accounts of this horrifying tale of survival, 3 live mules were counted among the final tally of people and possessions that arrived from the Donner Party's wayward camps. 3 mules, alive and unscathed. The Drift and Ramble podcast will continue after this. Are you a podcaster looking for an easy way to attract new advertisers to your podcast? At advertisecast.com, we have created a simplified service that allows podcasters to sell ad space on their show. How does it work? Just set up your free podcast profile at advertisecast.com. Then, it's published to our marketplace, where hundreds of advertisers shop for ad spots and podcast opportunities. It's totally free to add your listing. We earn a percentage of every order made by the advertiser. You keep 80% of the total sale, while we earn 20% to cover our operating costs. We also facilitate all payments and payouts and cover all credit card processing fees so you can stay focused on creating great podcasts. All it takes is just 5 minutes to add your listing. Drift and Ramble listeners simply visit advertisecast.com/drift. Once again, that's advertisecast.com/drift.
Hi, this is Cheryl. Your feedback is important to us. If you have a comment or suggestion, we'd really love to hear from you. You can contact us through our website, that's driftandramble.com. You'll see a listener survey button on every page, and we'd really appreciate your input on the survey. Please take a few moments to complete it, and you'll have our thanks in return.
There is an old proverb that says, you can't really understand another person's experience until you've walked a mile in their shoes. Comedian Steve Martin takes it a step further, if you'll pardon the pun, and says, before you criticize a man, walk a mile in his shoes. That way, when you do criticize him, you'll be a mile away and you'll have his shoes. But in the strange case of the man known as George Manous, George Warden, or George Parrott, also known as Big Nose George, we're left with shoes you probably wouldn't want to fill. You see, Big Nose George was a cattle rustler and highwayman in the Old West. And while his nose was large, his crimes were even bigger, culminating in the ultimate crime, when Parrott and his gang killed 2 law enforcement officers. In 1878, after a botched train robbery, Parrott and his crew hid out and made camp at Rattlesnake Canyon near Elk Mountain, Wyoming, in an isolated stretch of track near Medicine Bow River. Thinking they had eluded police, the crew had been tracked by Wyoming Deputy Sheriff Robert Widowfield and Union Pacific Detective Tip Vincent. On August 19, 1878, a gang lookout spotted 2 lawmen approaching. The robbers stamped out their campfire and hid in the brush. Widowfield arrived at their camp and placed his hands over the fire pit. Realizing the ashes were still warm, he turned to warn his partner, but before he could speak, he was shot in the face. Though Vincent ran for cover, he too was killed before he made it out of the canyon. The ambush catapulted Big Nose George's criminal career to new heights. The gang took the lawmen's guns and one of their horses before covering their bodies with brush and leaving the scene. Thinking they had covered their tracks, the gang fled, but the bodies were soon discovered, and a $10,000 reward was offered for the apprehension of the murderers. Later, that reward was doubled to $20,000. But with a price on their heads and little respect for the law, Big Nose George and his cohorts continued their crime spree. In February of 1879, a local merchant named Morris Kahn was taking large sums of money back east to buy stocks of merchandise. Big Nose George, Charlie Burris, also known as Dutch Charlie, and two others got wind of this opportunity, and despite the military convoy containing 15 soldiers, 2 officers, an ambulance, and a wagon from Fort Keogh, which was en route to collect the Army payroll, the men carried out a daring daylight robbery. At a site near present-day Terry, Montana, at a place now known as Kahn's Coulee, the soldiers, ambulance, and wagon train became strung out, allowing large gaps to form between all of the party members. George and his gang donned masks and hid at the bottom of the coulee near a turn at the bottom of the trail. The gang successfully surprised and captured the lead soldiers, as well as the ambulance containing Kahn. Patiently waiting for the rest of the team, they captured the remaining soldiers and the pay wagon. Depending on which report you read, Kahn was alleviated of between $3,600 and $14,000 in cash. Dutch Charlie was apprehended in 1879, but as the westbound train was bringing the outlaw to Rollins to stand trial, it was stopped by an angry mob in Carbon. Dutch Charlie was forcibly taken from the train and hanged from a telegraph pole by a mob of angry vigilantes.
String 'em up! Hang 'em!
Let's show 'em some hemp justice!
Big Nose George continued to drink, boast, and celebrate in Miles City, Montana. Eventually, the braggadocious bandit exposed himself as having a price on his head. He was arrested by 2 local deputies and returned to Wyoming to face charges of murder. The very same train that Dutch Charlie had been pulled from was once again stopped in Carbon. This time, Big Nose George was hauled off and prepared for lynching by that same angry mob.
String 'em up! Hang 'em! Let's show 'em some hemp justice!
However, George pleaded for his life and promised to tell all he knew about the murders, and the vigilantes cut him down. Escaping the noose, Big Nose George was then allowed to continue to Rollins to stand trial. Following the trial, Big Nose George was sentenced to hang on April 2, 1881. While serving time in jail, Big Nose George Parrott claimed that Frank McKinney, one of his cohorts in crime, had claimed to be Frank James, and the gang's leader, named Sim Jan, were none other than Frank and Jesse James. But McKinney, Jan, and the rest of the gang had disappeared and avoided apprehension. While in jail, Parrott whiled away the hours by working loose the rivets on his shackles, and by using a pocket knife and a piece of sandstone, he was able to wallow out and file the rivets of his heavy shackles around his ankles until he was able to free his legs. He then hid in the washroom until the janitor entered the area. Using the shackles he had just removed, Parrott struck janitor Robert Rankin over the head, fracturing his skull and slicing his scalp. Rankin was able to fight back, however, calling out to his wife, Rosa, for help at the same time. Grabbing a pistol, Rosa managed to convince Parrott that he was safer in his jail cell. News of the attempted escape spread through Rollins like a wildfire, and in the days of the Old West, vigilante justice was just as common as the rain. While Rankin was recovering from his injuries, masked men with pistols burst into the jail. They took Rankin's keys and dragged Parrott from his jail cell. But these were not his rescuers. These were townspeople bringing out Big Nose George to a lynch mob of more than 200 people. The crowd, hungry for a hanging, set about to string up old Big Nose. Townspeople hollered,
String 'em up! Hang 'em!
Let's show 'em some hemp justice.
People in the crowd continued to yell.
What tree should we hang him from?
Not finding many trees on the main street of town, the mob strung him up from a telegraph pole. But then, things started to get weird.
Who knows how to tie a noose?
Anyone here ever hang a man before?
The crowd was so eager to hang the man, they weren't very careful about the manner in which they did it. And this caused the noose to slip up behind George's ears, tearing them right off his head. They left old earless George hanging for several hours. Some say that when they finally cut Big Nose George down and put him in a pine box, his nose was so big they couldn't get the lid closed. And when the undertaker went to go find some nails to hold the coffin shut, 2 doctors slipped in and stole the remains. But in truth, it's more likely that no one came to claim the body. So Doctors Thomas McGee and John Osborne simply took possession of the body, perhaps to study the criminal's brain to see what might lead to criminal behavior. It's also rumored that McGee's own wife had been declared criminally insane in relation to a couple of horseback riding accidents. And through studying George's brain, Dr. McGee hoped that he could find help for his wife. Before they even started the autopsy, Osborne's strange behavior began. First, he created a death mask of Big Nose George using plaster of Paris, which depicts the man's prominent proboscis and mustachioed face, as well as his now earless head. Next, they removed the top half of the unfortunate criminal's skull, and the crudely sawn-off skull cap was presented to then 15-year-old Lillian Heath, who was a medical assistant to Dr. McGee.
Lillian, here is a gift for you.
Well, thank you, Doctor. I shall cherish it always.
Well, this brain looks perfectly normal.
That a 15-year-old girl was present at this dismembering may not be that much of a shock to those interested in the medical profession, but the anatomical gift was morbid at the very least. But strangest of all was when Osborne removed the skin from George Parrott's thighs and chest and sent it to a tannery in Denver with specific instructions to be made into a pair of shoes and a medical bag.
Dear Denver Tannery, please find enclosed the hides I would like to have prepared. As per our previous discussions, I should like the shoes, size 11.5, wingtips, with nipples facing upward, so as to be displayed beyond the drape of my trouser cuffs. I cannot stress enough the importance of these instructions. As for my medical bag, I shall leave that to your discretion. I anticipate your speedy reply. Sincerely yours, Dr. John Osborne.
John, looks like there's a package for you.
I do so hope it's from Denver. Oh, splendid, Tom, splendid. Oh, now that is disappointing.
When the shoes arrived, Dr. Osborne was disappointed that the nipples did not appear atop the shoes as he had specified. One version of the story we found was that Dr. Osborne had been aboard a train that was robbed by Big Nose George, and because of the delay the robbery caused, Dr. Osborne missed a party. Thus, his motivation for holding a grudge against the man with such a large nose. But in this freakish turnabout for Dr. Osborne, the shoes he made did not allow him to walk a mile in another man's shoes. Instead, they enabled him to walk a mile in the man himself. And if Dr. Osborne wasn't creepy enough as a doctor, just imagine what he might have been like as a politician. Because creepy or not, that's exactly where Osborne had set his sights. He became the first elected Democratic governor of the state of Wyoming, and he proudly wore those shoes made from Big Nose George to his own inaugural ball. And while this weird story of a wild outlaw's end began to fade from memory, the story really hadn't ended after all. Because in 1950, when some construction workers unearthed a whiskey barrel containing human remains near the site of Dr. McGee's old offices, the entire freakish story of Big Nose George came flooding back to haunt the tiny town of Rawlins. Inside the barrel were some very well-preserved bones, a bottle of vegetable compound, a skull with a severed top, and a pair of shoes said to be made from the flesh of Big Nose George, hideously reunited for almost all eternity. But while the remains were all but certainly identified as those of Mr. Parrott, the only missing piece of the puzzle was the top of that severed skull. A simple telephone call located Dr. Lillian Heath, that once 15-year-old medical assistant to Dr. McGee, and she, now in her 80s, still had that piece of human skull. Over all the years that it had remained in her possession, it had been used as a flower pot, an ashtray, a doorstop, and a conversation piece. And now, it was evidence in a not-so-mysterious case of forensic identification. She sent the skull top to be matched with its lower half, and the fit was a perfect match, thus confirming, with unquestionable certainty, the remains of Big Nose George. You see, young Lillian had become the first female doctor in the state of Wyoming, and she herself was quite a pistol. Although she preferred to dress more like a boy than the woman that she was, she also packed a pistol as she made her late-night house calls to the remote and often distant homesteads to treat her patients. And yet, she was also a perfect 36, modeling clothes for Denver's Daniels and Fisher's department stores. Smart, attractive, and fearless, she had made quite a life for herself after her humble encounters with the oddball Dr. Osborne. She continued to work with Dr. McGee for 5 years before attending medical school in Iowa. During that time, she assisted Dr. McGee with plastic surgery before it became the specialty that it is today. In fact, she and McGee had actually reconstructed a man's face after a botched suicide attempt with a gun. After medical school, she returned to Rawlins and later joined the Rawlins Bicycle Club and eventually married in 1889. She lived to be 96 and died in 1962, having never had to use that .32 caliber pistol she kept in her jacket pocket on those late-night house calls. She kept that skull top all those years as a souvenir of her medical achievements, and as gruesome as that sounds, it turned out to be the right move, because over half a century later, that piece of severed bone was reunited with its owner. While Big Nose George may have lost his ears, he remains among the strangest cases of vigilante justice ever tried. And those shoes? They're still on display today at the Carbon County Museum in Rawlins, Wyoming, where you can view the shoes and the death mask of Big Nose George. You can also see the watch given to Rosa Rankin by the county commissioners for coercing Big Nose George back into his jail cell with the barrel of her gun. The shackles worn by Big Nose George at his hanging and the top of his skull are on display at the Union Pacific Museum in Omaha, Nebraska. Oh, and that medical bag? Well, that was never recovered. So you may want to look carefully if your doctor carries a bag, because by now, the old bag may be showing signs of its age, and your doctor may just be looking for a replacement. Hold up there, partner. The Drift and Ramble podcast will be right back. Want to grow your business and reach new customers? Whether you're launching a new product, app, book, crowdfunding campaign, or looking to get your existing products and services in front of new potential customers, AdvertiseCast is a great solution. AdvertiseCast is the first online marketplace that lets you buy ad spots from hundreds of different podcasts and radio shows online. Simply shop listings online and see detailed information about each show. You'll be sure to find shows that work well for your product or service. Give us a shot and try podcast advertising today. For more information, please visit advertisecast.com. Once again, that's advertisecast.com. Hurry! 30-second ad spots are going for just $5. Today's episode couldn't have been possible without the help of the talented individuals from Audio Oblivious Productions, makers of the hilarious audio drama Winnebago Warrior, The Legend of John Waynaby. A special thanks and a huge round of applause for the following performances. Playing the role of the Jesuit missionary, random townsfolk, and the oddball Dr. Osborne, Austin Beach. Playing the role of First Nation scholar and historian, Basil Johnston, random townsfolk, and Dr. McGee, Drew Prophet. Playing the role of 15-year-old Lillian Heath, Wyoming's first female doctor and bone collector, Danielle Reese. And playing the role of the crazy Donner Party survivor, Mrs. Murphy, was our very own Cheryl Blizzin.
Go get the sandwiches, we're hungry.
Thanks to all of you for being part of our show, and here's to the opportunity to do it all again sometime soon. On the next Drift and Ramble podcast. Due to the graphic nature of this episode, listener discretion is advised. Of all the animals of the Wild West, none is so pervasive, so familiar, and so maligned as the coyote. Called a trickster, a prankster, and a shapeshifter, sometimes depicted as part man and part dog, the coyote straddles the worlds of darkness and light, sometimes as a harbinger of change. The pale dead moon, some call the hunter's moon, hangs awkward in the midnight sky. It's tangled in the stringy clouds torn to tattered shreds by the spiny pine tree tops huddled on the hillside, where the cold gathers into clumps, and streams must edge their way around the rocks so as not to disturb them from their ancient sleep. It's fear that motivates the water to tiptoe past the sleeping giants, and it's fear that wakes you from your sleep and compels you to peer out the window at this scene. Fear is the scratching in the ceiling, the raven's caw, and the creaking of the floorboards when nothing seen walks upon them. It's what causes you to find your shoes with your eyes and flip them over before you put your feet inside. Fear is what you fear most. It's not the scorpion inside your shoe. For that, you can easily dispatch, if you can only see it. But fear itself is unseen. It's unheard, yet just beyond a whisper where you cannot make out the words. It's fear that finds its way into the smallest confines of your thoughts and burrows deep inside them. Until we meet again, I'm Steve Blizzin. See you at the next installment of the Drift and Ramble podcast.
Howdy, folks. Pull up an ear whilst I spin you a tale. This is a tale fraught with peril and danger, redemption and renewal. A tale of a man determined to find the old West that he remembered from the silver screen of his youth. A man who wanted nothing more than to live the life of a lone wanderer, a drifter, a cowboy in an RV. As John's adventure begins, he meets the McCoy family. Axe McCoy.
Careful about that deal bearer now, John. He ain't all that's advertised. He's actually low quality in a brand name suit.
Lizzie McCoy.
Thank you, John. Well, very kind of you to say so, as I bat my eyelashes suggestively.
And their son Hatchet, McCoy.
Screw that, Paul. I wish to bear witness to the wrath that is your killing rifle, and the majesty that is your righteous fury.
And, of course, the man himself, John Wainaby.
Well, mister, you're about to find out what happens when a man is pushed past his normal threshold of patience.
John, order for John. Your hazelnut mocha latte and your gluten-free banana nut muffin is ready.
Oh.
You have a nice day, hon.
And he decides to help the McCoys in their land dispute with Sam the Deal Baron Wellington.
You hear me, McCoys? I'm speaking to the barista, but at a volume that's sufficient for y'all to hear me as well. I'm bringing in a professional.
That no good low-down Deal Baron, he done slashed the tires on my tractor so I can't harvest.
Do you know what's become of my pigs without mud to waller in? They stay clean. Now they think they're better than everyone else. They're elitist pigs.
Howdy, McCoy. Miss McCoy, y'all supposed to be gone yesterday.
Let me give him what for, boss.
Shut up, Dirty Steve.
It's time to pay the piper.
So come join me by the fire for some tales, maybe a song or two, in Winnebago Warrior, the tale of John Wainaby.
The Drift and Ramble podcast is a Clear Voice Media production, hosted and produced by Steve Blizin, with segment research and voice acting by Cheryl Blizin. Additional contributions and content have been made possible by support from individuals dedicated to the art and science of storytelling and exploring the still fertile promise of the American West.
There's only one word for it. Terrific. You know, I'm so proud of it, it's almost indecent of me.
Si, senor! Oops.